All right, y'all. Welcome to another FOIA Friday, a community podcast about all things FOIA and public records. Today we have a very special guest again, Miranda Spivack, who's a veteran reporter and just published a book about fighting for transparency. Miranda, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Thanks very much. It's great to be with all of you. I love FOIA Friday. I find it a fount of information and helpful tips. Um, as many of you, I think I've met before, but I am a former Washington Post reporter and editor. I left actually in the beginning of the Bezos era when attention to local news was on the downswing. Of course, it's gotten that much worse at the Post and lots of other places. And what happens is, as I soon realized, that civilians, non-journalists, people with just regular issues are trying desperately to fill the gap, frankly, by the diminishment of local news. And so, based on a series that I did for Reveal now, gosh, 8 years ago called State Secrets, I went out to find more of these people and try to tell their stories. And what I've written essentially is, I would say, a playbook for, people at the state and local level to try to extract information that's really important to their communities. And I'm sad to say that because of what's going on in Washington and the, excision of huge amounts of data and information and the dismantling of the federal government, which I think is what's going on, action at the state and local level becomes more and more important. So that's sort of where I am.
And I've got a lot of questions for you about that playbook, but before we get to that, I'm going to hop into the normal agenda, walk through some small updates. One question that came in from a FOIA Friday listener, who I don't know if she's on the call yet, but maybe she'll join. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. But before I do that, I'm going to drop the notes in the chat again. What I'm about to share with you, you can also find here. Um, and let's roll. So, updates wise, the Data Liberation Project, which I mentioned in previous FOIA Fridays, is rocking and rolling. We're working on a FEMA disaster housing data set right now that we got back. There were 80 tables to document. We are almost all the way through them, mostly thanks to one of our terrific externs who's been going through each of these tables and documenting what's there and what it means, maybe. We have 7 tables left. So if you want to help out and relieve the stress and labor of an extern who's just put in so much work to get this FEMA data out, take a look at those. Also this week, some people in the Data Liberation Project channel in our Slack were talking about archiving GIS data and NOAA data. Like Miranda just said, there is a huge amount of data that is disappearing for different reasons in different places. And lots of people who are interested in the archiving of that data and saving data are organizing in different ways. And there's a good amount of them in that channel. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, that's happening there. I demoed this last time, on our last FOIA Friday. I filed about 8 requests related to detentions of students recently. Those are still in the works, nothing big to update there. But if you weren't here last time and want to clone any of those requests to file elsewhere or about other students who have been detained, go check those out. The police disciplinary files project that we've been running for the last several months and taking um, responses from in our call out. Let me see where that call out is. There we go. Tell us where to file police disciplinary file requests. You can do that by going down to this form. We are getting a lot back in some places, including in Pierce County, Seattle. This request was to the prosecuting attorney of Pierce County. I believe this is directly from one of the responses we got back from our readers saying, hey, file this request in Pierce County. We've got a lot of responses back from other places, including in Florida, but Washington is turning out to be one of the most fruitful. If you go down here all the way to the bottom, we're getting rolling responses, which is also great. I would recommend if an FOIA officer offers you the chance for a rolling response. That has usually been pretty helpful for me. That just means instead of waiting to the very end to fulfill the request, they fulfill it in installments, and it gets you access to the document sooner, and helps kind of keep things on schedule. Let's see, this might take a while to download because it's hundreds of pages of police disciplinary notes and documents. But yeah, check that out. If you want to tell us somewhere else to file, you can follow this form. And while that's waiting to download, I'll go back here. Yeah, we also have some new guides that just dropped, written by one of our other externs, Maggie, who's on this call, who I'm going to ask to talk about those in 1 second. There she is. And then on the horizon, coming up on May 8th, we have Document Cloud office hours. If you're using Document Cloud to analyze documents that you've gotten back in your requests and you have questions about how to do that, about OCRing documents, about documents that come back in weird formats like .msg files, go over to Document Cloud office hours and ask our team about that. And then on May 15th, which is a really great day because that is my birthday as well, we will be talking about APIs and add-ons. So if you want to expand what Muckrock and Document Cloud do, all our code is open source, and we're trying to offer different ways for our users to customize and extend the type of things that you can do with both Muckrock and with Document Cloud. So if you do a good amount of programming or coding and also like Muckrock and Document Cloud, you can do a lot of fun things by customizing things more to whatever you're doing, and then hopefully make that open source and show other people how to do it as well. Real quick, since that just downloaded, this is what we got back in Pierce County. We're getting back a lot of it. Very similar to what we got back in New York when we were working with New York Focus and Sammy Sussman, which is both the letters of impeachment or letters of reprimand explaining, hey, this officer is being reprimanded for these reasons, and more specific documents in here about the incident. So that's really important. Like I've said before on previous FOIA Fridays, getting disciplinary files or police misconduct docs from police is very difficult. District attorneys or prosecuting attorneys in different states should be holding this information for the purposes of not allowing cops who have questionable records to be trusted the same way in court as ones that don't. And they're turning out to be a lot more successful to get documents from than police agencies. So yeah, take a look at those. And I'm going to pause there to ask Maggie to talk about these two guides that we just published, one on FOIA for emails and one on using FOIA to access law enforcement records.
Hi, yeah, so these are two quick guides. Well, one's quicker than the other. The emails guide is quite short, just some tangible tips for people, things like targeting inboxes, crafting keyword searches when you're searching for emails to avoid, being too broad and getting an overly burdensome response, using logs, things like that. And, we pulled out some different examples from Muckrock users. So if you've ever filed a request for emails, you could be featured in there. So check it out. And then if you're interested in law enforcement records, it's a much longer, almost literature review of different work that people have done to get law enforcement records using FOIA. It's a little bit of maybe a love letter to Chicago police accountability orgs like Invisible Institute, who I really admire, but there's a bunch in there in terms of complaints, misconduct, employment data, body cam footage, and the different exemptions that apply more specifically to law enforcement records and how to craft your request to sort of skirt around those edges or push back if you get some, silly responses from the agency. So hopefully those will be helpful to people, and I hope you enjoy them.
Thanks, Maggie. I just saw a question that we had come in from Elise Meyer. Do you recommend that we put a request for rolling response in a request, or only if the office offers it first? Good question, Elise. I have never tried to put it into a request beforehand. It usually comes after an agency has responded, but I think it's something if you imagine you have a large amount of documents you're asking for, and they span different time periods. And you know, though, that these are very specific documents that the agency will be able to find. It just might take them a while to find them for each of these different periods. Um, I think it's worth asking if they could respond in a rolling fulfillment. Miranda, do you have any experience with that you want to toss in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you should remind them, of course, what their obligations are first, which is to respond to your request in a certain amount of days, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Don't do it in Maryland. It's 30 days. And then they'll just tell you they got your request, which is where I am. But I would definitely, I think the whole point of this is to be conciliatory and helpful to the FOIA officer. And so, yeah, sure, mention that, if it's, better for them or useful to them, you would certainly consider, their willingness to, or you would ask for their willingness to, send it out piecemeal as soon as they get it, or rolling, or however you want to put it. I would, the whole point is to be nice to these people.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And I think one phrase I find myself using a lot in these sort of situations is amenable. I feel like you said, the whole idea is just to be amenable. If they're amenable and you're amenable, the request will probably come through a lot quicker, even if it is a smaller scope or rolling or not exactly the things you were looking for. Hopefully, you could build on that later on through more requests by being more amenable at the outset. Um, I'm going to get back into the doc real quick to answer a question that came in from Jordan Goss Pore. She asked in our feedback form, which is at the top of here, which is also a question form, so you can tell us both what is working about this call that you want more of, or what is not working that you want less of, and also if you just have any questions yourself, like this one that came from Jordan. She asked about what to do when the mayor's office takes 3 years to respond to your request seeking plans and emails about humanitarian emergency response relief centers and sends you city media releases and transcripts of the mayor's speaking publicly after 3 years. And she sent me over the actual request that she filed, and she was asking for correspondence between the Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, and several different people, and also plans, which as she just wrote as plans or documents, I think, related to the humanitarian emergency response and relief centers in the city. And so my recommendations to her are to break that up, that request up actually into two parts. First, the request for emails and correspondence. And then the second part, which is the documents or plans that she was interested in. I did a quick search for these humanitarian emergency response and relief centers, which I've seen in headlines but don't know much about since I'm not in New York City. And I found this press release, which on the external side kind of just looks like not much besides a press release that a mayor's office would release. But there are a couple things in here that could be useful for public records requests. The first is in this press release, lots of other people from other city agencies are quoted here as saying something about this program and what it's going to do. They're quoted here because their agencies are going to have to be a part of this. So immediately I'm thinking, okay, here's the other agencies that the mayor's office is enlisting to carry out these shelters or to build these shelters and carry out the functions of them. So here's potentially some agencies that could have an MOU with the mayor's office, or could be contracting with third parties, which they say somewhere down here, as well as contracted partners and providers. Okay, so now I know this is not going to be just these agencies here on this page. This is also going to be businesses contracted to work with the mayor's office or these other agencies. So when I'm thinking about emails, those are the parties that I'm interested in. So I would take that email and pick the agencies and the employees in those agencies that are most relevant. In Jordan's request, she didn't have a specific time frame, so I would narrow that down to a very specific time frame. I, again, do not live in New York City, but I've heard from lots of people that New York City is a very difficult place to get public records, and the agencies take a very long time. And so knowing that, I would especially try very hard to make the scope of an email request very small, and probably pick a specific event that happened that I'm looking for chatter around, whether it's the launch or a public scandal or something like that. And keep that time frame very tight, which again, as Maggie said, is part of the guide that she worked on earlier this week. I will put it together with key phrases like this request. So this was a request that was rejected and then eventually appealed, and then we got a good set of important emails for this investigation. But you can see here the kind of language I used was to, from, or CC'd, Jeff Wallach. To the date this is ultimately fulfilled. I think I filed that. Okay, so I filed this in January. So this is a pretty large time frame, October 1st to January. But I was probably guessing that there weren't going to be a lot of emails that would match these key strings: Coppers, pollution, violation, Independiente, Muckrock. These are the two newsrooms involved in this investigation. These are the key phrases. So I would go through that sort of plan by picking the employees, picking the specific time frame, narrowing down those key phrases, and then again checking out Maggie's guide. To the second part of Jordan's question, actually, I'm going to check the chat for questions real quick. It seems like there are a few there. Okay. I'm going to come back to some of these. Some of these are a little bit longer questions, but I'm going to come back to those a little bit later, and first just focus on the second part of this actually, which is so after the emails, Jordan said she was interested in plans about these emergency housing shelters. So my first advice is also going to be narrowing down what we mean by plans. Often when I'm thinking about large-scale projects like this put on by the mayor's office or a agency, immediately I'm thinking in my head about what is often called the performance gap, which is the gap between what is supposed to be happening and what is happening. So that's what I'm looking for in documents that I'm hoping to request. I want documents that show me what is happening and documents that show me what should happen or is not happening. And I think that's where accountability happens, in that gap between those two things. So if I can find out what's happening and then what should be happening and compare those two things, then I can explain what might be going wrong. So first thing, like I said, in that press release, there are several different agencies mentioned that might require an MOU. I just searched this on Google or your search engine of choice, which is what these are called: the Humanitarian Emergency Response and Relief Centers, New York City. And then I put a file type PDF to see what sort of documents would come up, because I don't know, maybe there's already reports by the mayor's office that they've published or any other kind of documents floating around. What I found was this executive order, which down towards the bottom mandates a MOU between the Mayor of Health and Human Services and H+H, which is, I think, one of the Health and Hospitals Corporation of New York City. So one of the first things I would request is that MOU. In this executive order, there's also some other agencies that are mentioned and are supposed to be carrying out different parts of this work. So those would be, yeah, cooperation of all agencies. This would give me a map of what agencies I might want to request which documents from. So MOUs, contracts. So that press release, like I said, mentioned third parties. Incidentally, I also found a Excel file of contracts just by doing the same thing that I did, but putting file type Excel. This often doesn't work. It sometimes does, which is nice. So this contract here is actually, or this Excel file here is actually a list of contracts. And so I pulled this up, and you can see the disclaimer here is that this was compiled by this tax agency, KPMG, and gives you a little bit about the data. Then I look at the data and I see, okay, HRRC, this is what these emergency shelters, their acronym is, are listed in this database of contracts, and you can immediately filter to ones that are the highest. You can see here, here's a $75 million contract with CYH Manhattan LLC. I'm not sure if this is for, yeah, there we go, HERRC specific. So that would be an interesting contract. They might be doing a lot of the building of all this stuff. And if I get that contract, then I can understand what they're actually doing and where that money is going. Lastly, I would check out audits, inspections, evaluations, and complaints. That's kind of the accountability angle. I wonder if there are any agencies in New York City that perform audits or inspections of the emergency shelters. Has the comptroller done an audit of the program? Does the mayor office itself issue reports or evaluations? And just actually typing in, again, this program and then complaints, I found this Legal Aid Society guide for people arriving at the shelters, which describes how one can file a complaint. And they say, if you are in one of these shelters, asked to submit a complaint, some do have a complaint form, some don't. So I would request the forms for that are prepared for different shelters to see which shelters you can submit this form to, and then also eventually request the complaints themselves. So I hope that is helpful for Jordan. I will probably loop back over email and see if that turns out to be useful. Yeah, I will take a look at these questions towards the end of the call, but we don't have a lot of time with Miranda, and I want to make the most use of the time that we do. So I'm going to hop into our conversation and bring it back to what you were mentioning at the beginning of this call, which is our current administration. And you wrote this book about fighting for transparency at a time before or right before we had a government that promised transparency, or at least Elon Musk had said at one point that Doge will potentially make FOIA useless because everything will be public, when meanwhile what's actually happening is FOIA officers are being laid off and data is disappearing. What's changed since you wrote the book? What's different? What's the same?
Good question. Well, first of all, as far as Elon Musk goes, I would say anything he says, just assume the opposite is true. Secondly, state, federal, local governments have never been paragons of transparency. If anybody knows of one, please let me know, because actually I'd like to applaud them. And for a lot of state and local governments in particular, the whole concept of transparency is not well funded by either the state legislatures or the county council or whomever, the county government or whomever is controlling what's going on in that area. So it's not a high priority usually. And for smaller communities, I will say I'm a little bit sympathetic because their budgets really are tight and probably going to get worse now as, we move into a likely recession if we're not already there. So, if a legislator at the state level has to pick between funding schools to make up perhaps for some of what's going to be lost from the federal government, like for school lunches or Title I schools or whatever, and weigh that against spending a little bit more to be more transparent, which they inherently don't like anyway, they're going to go for schools. And, that will be a tough argument to combat. I mean, I can say they don't like transparency, and they don't generally, but they can also they're able to hold up this, look, we did this and here's why. And that's hard to argue against. So I think things are getting worse. The Associated Press did a story probably a year and a half ago. I would have to dig it out again. It's cited in my book, just showing that what data there are, which is not, I mean, other than Muckrock, there's not a lot of places to go to really evaluate how states and localities are doing on transparency. But based on Muckrock data, the AP noted that things were getting worse, and I think that's true. I think, though, partly because of this sort of slash and burn approach by Elon Musk, who um, seems to know nothing about how government works or all the very valuable pieces of information that our government, our federal government, and states and localities have collected over the many, many years. I think that, there is going to be more pressure put at the state and local level. First of all, if you look at something like education, a lot of the data that the federal Department of Education, which seems to be disappearing before our eyes, except to harass people, states on DEI and other issues, that a lot of their data comes from the states. So the states haven't gotten rid of that data yet, although some are very intrigued with what the federal government is doing in terms of just eviscerating data. But for example, if you want to know something about how charter schools are funded in your state, and that's information that the federal government also has collected, go to the state and ask for it. Ask for communications, between state agencies and federal agencies, and in both directions, because of course the feds are sending down all these directives saying, don't do this, don't do that, we're not going to fund you, et cetera. Be interesting, obviously, to know what those are, but also figure out what the states are sending to Washington and go to the states to get it. It's not a perfect system. It's going to be very labor intensive. The efforts that Dylan mentioned about preserving data and trying to um, safeguard it are ongoing. How successful that will be, I don't know. So I think you have to think about state and local now even more than 5 years ago when I started on the book.
So it sounds like maybe you wouldn't change a lot about your book because state and local is what your book champions.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that what the book and the whole reason I was intrigued by the issue about transparency or lack thereof at the state and local level is A, it's really where people encounter government most often. I mean, unless right now you're trying to call Social Security, which is a nightmare, the odds that you have come into contact with government is going to be at the state or local level, often about schools, actually, sometimes about health issues, public safety, policing, et cetera. And that is at the state and local level. And when I was at the Washington Post for many, many years, and I was always on the local staff, both as an editor and a reporter, and I'm a big, big champion of local news still. The Post, which has obviously got multiple mandates. Most of my colleagues were focused clearly on federal government transparency or lack thereof. And that's very important. And in fact, right now, it's more important than ever. So I don't begrudge them that. But I was always very intrigued about how difficult it was for me and people I covered to get information from county governments. One of the biggest transgressors, I guess you would say, was Prince George's County, Maryland, which, just did not like seeing reporters come around and ask for stuff and didn't like members of the community either coming around. And, they also often came up with big bills that people had to pay. And, actually, Montgomery County, Maryland is hardly a paragon of virtue. There was some story done by a colleague of mine several years ago that I think planning agency asked for $65,000 for a FOIA. I mean, just ridiculous. So again, I think this is really where people's lives intersect the most. And I think, therefore, it's very important that we understand this, that we laud the people who learn to tackle this, and that we put pressure on the state and local level now to be more transparent. And I will just say one other thing about that, which is I think a lot of people are upset, desperate, feeling very worried about the federal and whether they can really have an impact. And I think you can, but I think if you really think you have an issue and want to make a difference, start locally. It will spiral. And some of the people in my book do have issues that started locally and became national issues. So from the ground up is what I'm saying.
Well, let's dig into that because your book, it talks a lot about the champions at the local level, people who are not journalists. And I think we talk
Right,
about that a lot at Muck Rock. The heroes of these stories are not journalists collecting public
right,
records. It's the act of collecting public records itself that anyone can do this.
right.
Anyone can file a FOIA request. Um, Tell me about the man in New York who was investigating water quality in his.
Yeah. So I'm sure most of you have heard of forever chemicals, and actually, sad to say, the Trump administration is undoing a lot of things that the Biden administration put in place to try to protect water systems and public drinking water against these pollutants, which are cancer causing. So, the guy in Hoosick Falls, New York, a small town outside of Albany that looks actually. Was the subject of Grandma Moses paintings. I mean, it's got that in a look of just Americana about it. And so this fellow, Michael Hickey, is an insurance underwriter. So he knows how to do some research, but what happened to him was his father died of very rare form of cancer. And he was obviously bereft. And one way he tried to assuage some of the feelings he had was to start to research this kind of cancer. And through very sophisticated, but he learned to do this, internet searches, he stumbled upon forever chemicals, PFAS, and learned that, they are ubiquitous. They're really everywhere. They're in furniture, they're in the groundwater, they're all over the place. And he finally figured out that it was very possible that the public water system in his small community was polluted because there were some companies that had been there for years that made Teflon-like products, tents and pieces of tools that were coated with the equivalent of Teflon to make them, water resistant, waterproof, whatever. And anyway, through a very complicated effort, he figures this out. He goes to the mayor, and the mayor's response, and he's not the current mayor, but the mayor's response was, oh, we don't want this to become public because we're in the middle of this program. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but Hoosick Rising, and we're trying to get this town on the map and be a destination and whatever. So we don't want to deal with this. And this guy was like, what? And of course he had checked around, and there were a lot of people in the town who had cancer. And, perhaps for different reasons, who knew? But it was certainly worth investigating the water system, which he did on his own. And in the course of that, the guy who became the new mayor after the old mayor decided it maybe wasn't smart to run again. The new mayor, who's the high school music teacher, I mean, this is how down to earth and real this is. So he learns to file public records requests with the state of New York. And in New York, it's called FOIL, Freedom of Information Law, I think, FOIL. And people do get foiled by FOIL, I'll tell you that. Um, and through his public record requests, it turns out that there were a lot of people in the state government who had some sense that the water was polluted in this community and really hadn't acted, which is very disturbing. So this is a case where once people sort of learn that they had this tool, which most people frankly don't know until something happens to them or their community, and they like, what do I do? And they learned to do this. But, they did get information from the state government that was pretty damning. And we were sort of able to build a movement after that. Now this town is it's actually not a town, I think it's called a village, but anyway, is getting a new water system thanks to the state of New York. There are still, unfortunately, some lingering questions about whether this is going to work or not, but So at least it's a victory now. We'll see what happens. But, you know, these people were not trained to do this and really learned by doing. And also learn to organize, to build a network, to, get your neighbors involved, all the things that you have to do to make a difference.
What sort of documents did they request and then get back? One of
You
the
know,
things, this is a really important topic, water quality, and I was
yeah,
talking at the top of the call about air quality or mentioning an investigation about air quality. Environmental laws, I actually find are really great for public records because
yeah.
they specify so much documentation.
Right. So this is a little complicated because it turns out this community is very small. It's a few thousand people. And so it's exempt from a lot of reporting requirements to the EPA
Oh,
that in particular, I think I can't remember. I should know. I think it's about 10,000 where they had to be testing the water and they had to be reporting it. So there was not a lot there, and even discovering that exemption, which they were able to do because they asked for, reports and scientific findings and stuff, and a lot of it didn't exist. And the reason was because of this exemption from federal law. But they were asking for emails that where there was communication between the mayor, the reluctant mayor, and the
oh,
state.
okay. The previous.
There was a lot of communication, that showed a level of awareness that, of course, these public officials did not uh, hand out easily, and they certainly weren't telling the community that they had a level of awareness pretty early on. I mean, really, since Michael Hickey started to ring the bell, they started to pay attention, but they didn't tell the people that for a long time. So, it's reports. I mean, when you mentioned you had a good list in general, it was audits, contracts, reports. I mean, there's a lot of environmental reporting, and the way to get at that is to actually ask the state environmental agency, what do you collect? Give me a list of what kind of reports you collect every year or every 6 months or quarterly or whatever. And water systems do have to report, although, again, size of the community may matter a lot. And of course, it's going to get worse under Trump. I mean, they're probably going to exempt, communities of way more people if they figure this one out. Hope they're not on this call.
Right. And I will just plug, speaking of which, next week, I think, or the week thereafter, we're going to publish a guide on the environment and public records laws based on some
Great.
other guides that I wrote that were more specific about the Clean Air Act and public records. One of our other externs is expanding that into just kind of broadly under different environmental laws, what sort of reports, evaluations, those sort of things are available.
Right, right.
Um, Let's talk about another one of these heroes, a woman whose husband was a firefighter. Can you tell
Yeah,
me more about her story?
yes, I can. This book is not about forever chemicals, but it happens that two of the five communities I ended up profiling encountered problems with forever chemicals, PFAS. So this is a case of a woman now she lives in New Hampshire, but she was in Worcester, Mass for a long time, and her husband was a career firefighter in the Worcester Fire Department. And like a lot of firefighters, and if you look this up, the incidence of cancer in the fire service nationally is higher than the general population. Um, so her husband got prostate cancer and had to have surgery and then was sort of unable to return to work. Can be side effects. And so, she was really heartbroken. I mean, I think that their whole life had sort of been revolved around the fire service. Their friends were there, people they socialized with. They used to go on vacation to, I think it was Moosehead Lake in Maine with a bunch of friends. It's a whole community and a subculture too, in many ways. And this woman did not go to college. She she started researching, really, I mean, the internet's, compared to when I started in journalism, which is an eon ago, the internet is an unbelievable tool. You don't understand, some of you folks generationally, what a huge difference it's made to any kind of investigating. But anyway, she started doing research and had never done this before. And came to connect the fire, what they call turnout gear, which is the protective gear that firefighters wear, and that includes underwear, pants, jackets, hats, helmets, to protect them from chemicals that they inevitably encounter when they go in to fight a fire. I mean, every piece of furniture now has been coated with God knows what. And there are other also bad things that come into the air when a fire starts. So this gear, which costs about $1,000 per set. So right there you got a problem because if it wears out, I mean, some firefighters I interviewed said they wore the same gear for 10 years. I mean, I don't wear the same clothes for 10 years, and I'm not looking to protect myself against, dangerous chemicals, but these are expensive, and communities, it's hard for them to buy new gear. So what happened, this woman, Diane Cotter is her name, began to discover that they had kept her husband's turnout gear. And she looked at the pants and, realized that it had sort of worn out. And after she was so tenacious that she actually got Aaron Brockovich to call her back once. And Brockovich said to her, what about forever chemicals? What about PFAS? She didn't know anything about it and then began to research that and began to realize that this gear was coated with PFAS related chemicals. And while the intention is good, which is to slough off heat, water, dangerous stuff, it also was degrading and falling apart. And so Diane's presumption has been that it probably made its way into the bodies of firefighters or the exposure, it falls apart and then the chemicals are released and so the exposure is far greater than anybody knew. And, she got a scientist at Notre Dame to help her. She learned about this regulatory system, which is basically outsourced to a private organization that does capitalize on scientists and firefighters and government officials to set standards. Um, and, her thing was not so much public records requests, but she had trouble, as many of us do, finding stuff that was on the public record that would have perhaps explained some of this. I mean, it just didn't exist. So, and then she started to learn about this National Fire Protection Association, which is essentially the standard setter for the fire industry, firefighting industry. And just began to look at the bios of people there and, figure out who they were perhaps maybe connected with that might cause a conflict. Was everybody really looking out for the firefighters here? Or were they looking out for the industry? So her journey was a little bit different from Michael Hickey's, but had to use incredible investigative skills that she taught herself.
Yeah, and what this makes me think of is actually a couple months ago for one of our FOIA Fridays, we had Michael Schudson on the call, who wrote a book called The Rise of Right to Know, which he traces back the culture of transparency that came around FOIA to big changes in post-war America in consumption, and so in consumer rights and consumer advocacy, and in environmental rights and advocacy. And
Yeah,
I think that's such an important part of your book is like these are the topics that hit people right around them in their
yeah,
families, in their
right,
community, because suddenly you
right.
don't know what's in something, or you don't know what you're drinking, or you don't know these things that are going on around you, and the government regulates it because it's happening at such a large scale. Instead of having a mom and pop grocery store where you can just ask the grocer, what's in this thing you sold me? You have a giant supermarket, and to know what's in those products, someone else has to regulate that. And then you have to ask the government how they're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, the another aspect of the book is how governments, because they have done a lot of outsourcing, and this started with the Reagan administration really in very seriousness and was also replicated at the state level. So they, outsource the school bus drivers to a private company or some kind of organization or, private company that builds schools or builds buses or does something that, or picks up the trash that's, very much privatized now. And what happens with that is that the information that you might want often resides now with the private company. And one of the answers you will get from state and local governments is, we don't have that information, which of course is ridiculous because they could have it, but they will say they're not the repositories of it. That's true with police body cam videos. The company that's Taser has a lot of control over body cam videos, and then they'll say, "Oh, to release it, it's going to be a trade secret. We can't." I mean, the growth of the trade secret exemption around the country is just amazing and bad. And, it's an easy out for the government because they can say, oh, we don't have it anymore. Of course, they had a contract with this company and sort of like this crazy business in El Salvador. Why can't you just get it? You're the government, you're paying these guys. Actually, I'm paying these guys because I'm the taxpayer. So that's a whole nother dimension to this is sort of, I mean, some people, I haven't used the word collusion in the book, but a lot of people have as they've described the book, where they'll say that, this is government and industry working together against communities and keeping secrets. And I think we see a lot of that.
Yeah. And I will also highlight that that's something you and I talked a lot about in our last call. So if you're on this
Yeah.
call and you're like, oh, there is some sort of government agency that I know is contracting with a business or a nonprofit in my community. I wish I knew what they were doing, but I didn't know that they were subject to public records or if they would be. Miranda and I talked a lot about that on our last call and walked through some of the ways and reasons that those nonprofits or businesses are subject to public records law because they're performing a government's function.
Yeah, I mean, you'd still have to make the request to the government because the private industry, whatever, is going to be able to say, no, we're a private entity. But, the information should be available through the government, and they should, if they don't possess it, they should be able to get it because they're the ones who let the contract. There's an example of that that I wrote about when I did my state secret series for Reveal, which is, as I said, I think 9 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever. And it was a bus company called New Flyer that the Los Angeles Transit Authority had contracted with. And one way the company won the contract, which was millions and millions and millions of dollars, was by promising to do certain things, pay certain wages, provide certain benefits, et cetera. And so when a outside nonprofit that represents labor organizations and workers asked to see the reports about whether New Flyer was complying with the terms of the contract, the Los Angeles Transit Authority was ready to give it out, and New Flyer came in and did what's known as a reverse FOIA lawsuit and said, no, 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 you can't give that out. It's trade secrets. Our competitors are going to get tipped off or whatever. And so this group called Jobs to Move America had to sue, and they did, and they had to sue, the in state court, and they won. And then they got the reports. I mean, this took years, of course. They got the reports, and guess what? New Flyer was not living up to the terms of the contract. Now, you would have hoped that the government agency might have picked that up themselves. I will say, I mean, I do feel for people in state and local government because they are perpetually underfunded and it's only going to get worse. Okay, so it would have been nice though if somebody had said, okay, let's look, we had this contract for 2 years. Have they complied? They didn't do that. If they did it, it didn't ever come to light. But, then the terms of the contract were not being met. And this one, I'm sad to say, went to a lawsuit, which is a big problem.
Well, now we're into the nitty-gritty details. That's kind of how your book ends as well. Tell us about some of the resources or the kind of step-by-step guide how-tos you give at the end of the book for readers to take away and get active in fighting for transparency in their community.
Yeah, I will do that. I will say this, that if you read the individual stories, which are 5 chapters about 5 different individuals and their fights, you will get some tips out of those chapters too, like triangulation. Okay, the feds won't give me the information, but maybe the state has the information and I'll go to them. So, just figuring out who has the information you want. So if you get turned down by one branch of government, go to another one. that comes through in some of the individual stories, and also how these accidental activists, as I call them, went about their business is pretty deeply described. So there's that too. Don't just flip to the last chapter, is what I'm saying. But it is, or it's second to last because there's a conclusion, but it is entitled Playbook for Accidental Activists. And as I said, I think at the outset, when we were talking about different people who've written to Dylan and said, I need help, I said, be nice to these people. And, that's like rule number one. If you go into your local government, and I would say try to do it in person if you can, figure out who you need to deal with, find out what kind of information they have, what they can get you, and do it very politely. And unfortunately, what happens is people are so frustrated, that they lose it in these settings, and you just have to hold back. I cannot stress that enough. I mean, I've had reporters tell me, how obnoxious they can be, and it's like, please, just don't do that. Just take a deep breath and try to figure out what it is you want. So that's, identify the people in local government and local institutions who might have the information you have. So if the school board won't give it to you, maybe the principal of the school might help you out. I would definitely do many, many kinds of online searches for your topic to see who else in other states may have encountered this. And I think inevitably you'll find somebody, and try to get in touch with those people and see how they went about trying to get the information. Some state and local governments do post information on websites, and I would definitely try to find that information. You may save yourself a lot of time. I mean, there is still some, what they call in this business, proactive public disclosure, which basically means they're putting stuff up on their website. There are good open government guides state by state from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And even if you're not a reporter, and they are a little bit too legalistic, I think, written because they're written by lawyers, but there's still some very useful tips in there about how to go about getting information and what your rights are, which does differ from state to state. For example, Virginia and Alabama, where one of my accidental activists is, Virginia brought somebody, and I guess the state government brought this case to the Supreme Court, and the McBurney case, and the Supreme Court, and this is a while ago, it's way before this crowd got on the court, ruled that Virginia only had to give out public records to state citizens, not even state residents, but state citizens. Alabama does that too. In fact, as I was trying to do some research there, one agency gave me some information, but then when I went back a year later to get more, they said, "Oh, you're not a citizen of the state. We're not going to give it to you." I had to get somebody in the state to do it for me, which Muckrock actually has a network that will maybe do that for you. Something to think about.
Yeah, we do have proxies. I will say I'm challenged in Alabama myself right now because
Yes.
the agency is saying even with the proxy, they're asking us to send like a picture ID and things over
Yeah, it's
responding
just
to us.
terrible. And the governor there, they issued something a year or so ago, and this is in the book, saying how they had become more transparent. And I was like, really? Where? I mean, it's a very tough environment for people. And then the other thing I would do is, even though I've lamented the decline of local news, there are news organizations, there are community listservs, there are ways to get the word out. A lot of the people that I wrote about used Facebook to find like-minded people and and also to spread the word about their issue. I would not, I know that's sort of generational too, where a lot of young people are like, oh, I'm just going to do Instagram or TikTok or whatever. But, Facebook has still got a lot of people on it doing a lot of talking. And it's a way to find like-minded people from whom you can learn. I mean, often if you have an issue, somebody, as I said before, somebody somewhere has also dealt with it. So. So those are some of the tips.
Those are great tips. And we're nearing the end of the hour, so I'm going to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions for you, Miranda, and while I wait for some
Okay.
questions to come in, I selfishly want to ask the question that I'm interested in, which is, You're a veteran reporter. You spent a lot of time filing public records requests in your career up to
Wow.
now. Did you learn anything new about FOIA or public records writing this book?
That's, you know, that
If
is
so, I hope I don't have to write a whole book to learn
ah.
anything about public records requests.
I think that I think what I learned was sort of the much more in much more detail, the downside of all this outsourcing. I
Hmm.
mean, for example, and there is a chapter in the book about this, in the criminal justice system, the use of proprietary software to set bail, to decide if somebody can get out of prison early, to determine parole, whatever, it's all being done now by private industry, basically. And then parole boards. And in the case of this fellow in the book who was trying to get out of prison after having a stellar in prison record and couldn't get out, the parole board itself, they don't even know what's going into the decision making of these in these algorithms that then they're abiding by. And so I think there has been a whole shift to the private sector. And, Musk is the paragon of this, right? He wants to privatize everything. I think the shift to the private sector has been really damaging to our democracy. I will say that. Um, while you're looking for questions, I'm going to selfishly and promoting, I'm going to put a link into the chat about the book. I hope you all will buy it if you can. I would encourage you to go to bookshop.org, which is not Amazon, it's the anti-Amazon, and help support local bookstores around the country. So, anyway.
And I will say in the tip sheet for today, I already had a link to the book on bookshop.org. So
Oh,
I just
okay.
dropped it right back
Way,
in the chat.
way ahead of me. Okay. Oh,
Um,
great. Okay, thanks, Dylan.
of course, we had one question come in from Paulina who asked how you found
Ah,
the subjects of the book, and she also says she's ordering the book.
yes, thank you for ordering it. So, reporting, what can I say? I read everything I could. I Googled every sort of topic I was interested in, which was pretty simple, secrecy, transparency, state, whatever. I talked to lawyers who knew some of these folks. The American Bar Association has a lot of resources actually that are worth looking at, and you don't have to be a member. I'm not a lawyer. A lot of that's online. A lawyer who had written about this situation in Alabama, where community was trying really hard to get a functioning sewer system and was being obstructed at every turn just for information about what the problems were and what the government was doing about it and where a lot of public money was going. She had actually worked with this community, and I tracked her down and I talked to her about who might be worthwhile for me in the community to talk to. And, so that way, I mean, it was sort of as most reporting is, you find one source, they lead to another, they lead to another, they lead to another. I did want and worked hard to have both geographic diversity, gender diversity, and ethnic diversity, to which I more or less succeeded. There is no West Coast story, although there are a lot of problems on the West Coast, which I'm able to talk about. In fact, I did a thing a year ago for the San Francisco Public Press, and, you know, plenty of problems on the West Coast. They're just not really in the book. But just basic reporting, shoe leather reporting, a lot of it online. I started a lot of this in 2020 during the pandemic, which was good and bad, obviously. But one thing about it is a lot of people were home, so I was able to track a lot of people down easily. But I probably talked, I don't know, I might have talked to 30 or 40 people before I settled on the five.
Well, we're at 2 o'clock. Is there anything else you want to leave folks here with before we head off into the rest of our FOIA Friday?
Well, I guess one thing I've always said to people, which is before you file a FOIA, just see if you can get the information some other way, by your own personal charm, by finding the person who has the information, by doing a lot of polite in-person contact, if you can possibly do that. Um, I I think there's more out there than people realize, and sometimes if you file a FOIA, it sort of starts to raise all kinds of issues that you might have been able to avoid. So I would say start very, very, slowly and with the idea that they're just going to help you. It's the government, right? They're here to help you. Not, but we know it's worth a try.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a joy to have you here. And for anyone who's going to be reading Miranda's book, if you do get that book and read it, let me know. I'd love to have that person come back and share some about Miranda's book.
Me too.
Miranda, I'd love to have you on again anytime.
Oh, it's great. I love being with you guys and, you know, onward to more transparency.
Perfect place to end it. All right. See ya.
Yep. Thanks.